The steel door is 4 inches thick, sealed with 3 heavy turn wheels, and a rubber gasket meant to withstand a nuclear blast. For the first 6 months, I thought the door was meant to keep the radiation out. I thought the fallout shelters built by the military in the late 70s were designed for war, for invisible particles floating in the air, for burning skies and ash. I was wrong. The door wasn't built to keep the air out. It was built to keep them from getting in. My name is Mark. I have been living in sub-level 4 of the Blackwood Ridge bunker for 412 days. I know the exact count because every morning, after checking the oxygen scrubbers and the water recycler, I take a rusty nail and scratch a vertical line into the painted steel wall next to my cot. I am alone. I have been alone since day 12, when the station manager, a quiet man named Miller, made the mistake of looking through the periscope. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just stood there at the brass eyepiece for 3 full minutes, his body perfectly rigid, until he slowly backed away, walked over to the airlock controls, and opened the outer hatch. I tried to stop him. I lunged across the control room, screaming his name. But he looked at me with eyes that were wide, bloodshot, and completely devoid of human thought. He didn't open the door to run away. He opened it because he wanted to let it in. I managed to slam the secondary blast door just in time, trapping Miller in the decontamination chamber with whatever had been waiting outside. The sound that followed wasn't the sound of a man being attacked by an animal. It was the sound of wet leather tearing, followed by a voice, Miller's voice, whispering through the ventilation duct. Mark, his voice had said, perfectly calm, perfectly clear, as if he were asking to borrow a pen. You should come out. The sun is so bright today. The sun had been dead for 3 months since that day. I have followed a strict survival routine. I eat 1 compressed ration bar at 8 in the morning and another at 6 in the evening. I drink 2 cups of recycled water. I check the pressure gauges on the hydraulic door locks twice a day. And I never, under any circumstances, approach the periscope after the red warning light on the control console begins to flicker. The red light indicates movement on the surface dot in the beginning. The movement was chaotic. Scrambling sounds on the concrete hatch above, heavy thuds that made dust fall from the rusted ceiling pipes, the sound of metal scraping against metal. Whatever was roaming the dead wasteland above was searching, hunting, trying to find a seam in the bunker's armor. But over the last month, the sounds changed. They stopped trying to break the door. They started trying to talk. It began with small things. The sound of my mother's voice calling me for dinner from the top of the stairwell. My mother died 15 years ago in an auto accident, but the voice outside knew the exact cadence of her laughter, the exact way she mispronounced my middle name when she was irritated. Then came the voices of people I had never met, dozens of them, hundreds of them, all speaking at once through the intake pipes, creating a low, rhythmic hum that sounded like a congregation chanting in an empty cathedral. They know everything about us. They know our names, our memories, our regrets. They use our past like a key, trying to find the one lock that will make us turn the wheel and open the hatch. Yesterday, the intake pipe produced a new sound, not a voice. A knocking, 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the inner vault door. Right at the bottom of the 200-foot stairs, something had gotten past the upper hatch. I sat on the edge of my cot, holding a heavy pipe wrench in my trembling hands, staring at the reinforced steel vault door at the end of the narrow corridor. The air in the bunker felt thick, metallic, tasting faintly of ozone and stale sweat. The low hum of the diesel generator was the only constant companion I had left, but even its rhythmic thrum couldn't drown out the sound coming from the corridor. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't a violent pounding. It was polite, casual, like a neighbor knocking on your front door to drop off the mail. Mark, a voice called out through the intercom system. My breath hitched in my throat. The intercom system was connected exclusively to the surface observation post, a small concrete pillbox 200 feet above my head. The wiring for that system had been severed during the initial collapse when the surface was scorched. The screen on the console was cracked and dead, covered in a layer of grime. Yet the speaker above my head crackled with static, and the voice came through again. It was my own voice, not a mimicry. Not an imitation. It was my voice, with every nuance, every rasp, every breath I took when I spoke aloud. Mark, I know you're holding the wrench, my voice said from the rusted speaker. I know your hands are sweating. I know you're looking at the emergency lever on the wall. I backed away from the door until my shoulder blades pressed against the cold concrete of the back wall. Tears of sheer terror filled my eyes, blurring the dim yellow light of the overhead bowl. Why are you staying down there? My voice continued, sounding strangely sympathetic, almost sad. There's nothing left down there. The water filters are failing. The seals on the air scrubbers are rotting. In 3 weeks, you'll be breathing carbon monoxide. You know this. You checked the pressure logs this morning. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. He was right. I had checked the logs. The seals were degrading. I had calculated that I had less than a month before the atmosphere in sub-level 4 became unbreathable. We can fix it, Mark, the voice said gently. Just turn the middle wheel 90 degrees to the left. Disengage the hydraulic locks. It takes 3 seconds. I raised the pipe wrench, pressing the cold steel against my temple, trying to focus on the physical sensation, trying to keep my mind anchored to reality. Rule of survival number 1. Never negotiate with the surface. I closed my eyes and began counting backward from 100. 99, 98, 97, outside the vault door. The polite knocking turned into a scraping sound. Something soft and wet was sliding down the metal surface of the door, moving from top to bottom, like a massive slug trailing thick mucus across the steel. The air vent directly above my cot groaned. I snapped my eyes open. The metal grate covering the vent was bending inward. The heavy steel screws holding it to the concrete ceiling were turning slowly, unscrewing themselves, dropping one by one onto the concrete floor with a sharp clink, clink, clink. Something was inside the ventilation shaft. Something that didn't need to break the vault door because it was small enough, fluid enough, to compress itself through an 8-inch air pipe. A thick, dark liquid began to drip from the edges of the vent, splashing onto my blanket. It looked like motor oil, but it smelled like old copper and damp earth. I scrambled off the cot, dropping the wrench, and sprinted toward the secondary emergency room, the tiny, windowless storage closet where we kept the backup oxygen tanks. I slammed the heavy iron door of the closet, turned the latch, and collapsed onto the cold floor in the dark. The storage closet was barely 5 feet wide. It smelled of rubber, rust, and old canvas. Sitting in total darkness, I listened to the sound of my own ragged breathing. The air in here was stale, thin, and cold, but it was the only safe pocket left in the entire complex. Through the heavy door, I heard the final vent screw hit the floor outside. Then came a sound that made my skin crawl. It was the sound of something spilling out of the pipe, a heavy, wet mass collapsing onto the cot, followed by the rustle of my bedding, and then footsteps. They weren't human footsteps. They sounded like dozens of tiny, rigid points clicking against the concrete floor, like a giant crab or a massive insect walking around my small living quarters. The clicking moved slowly across the room. It stopped at the desk. I heard the sound of paper turning. It was reading my journal. The rusty nail I had used to scratch the days into the wall was dragged across the concrete, making a high-pitched screech that set my teeth on edge. Then, the clicking footsteps approached the storage closet door. They stopped just on the other side of the thin iron panel. A long silence stretched out. Minutes passed, so quiet I could hear the blood rushing through the veins in my ears. Then came a soft, delicate tap on the iron door, just one. A light, curious tap. Right at eye level, I found your entries. A voice whispered through the keyhole. It wasn't my voice this time. It wasn't Miller's voice or my mother's voice. It was a voice made of 1,000 different people speaking in unison, men, women, children, old people, all speaking the exact same words at the exact same millisecond, blending together into a chilling, harmonious choir. You wrote that you were lonely, Mark. The choir whispered. You wrote that the silence was driving you mad. We are never lonely. We share every thought, every dream, every memory. A small, thin tendril black as pitch, glistening with that oily fluid, slid under the gap at the bottom of the closet door. It didn't reach for me. It simply unfurled like a dying flower, waving gently in the draught. "Look at it, Mark," the choir said. "Touch it. Just one touch, and you'll never have to count the days again." I stared at the black tendril. My mind felt foggy, heavy, as if I had taken a strong sedative. A strange sense of warmth began to spread through my chest. The fear was fading, replaced by a deep, overwhelming exhaustion. Why was I fighting so hard? Why was I hiding in a dark box, drinking recycled wastewater, waiting to suffocate in 3 weeks anyway? It would be so easy. Just reach down, touch the tendril, end the isolation. My hand moved involuntarily, reaching down toward the floor, my fingers hovering an inch above the dark, shimmering surface of the tendril, and then, from deep within the bunker's lower mechanics room, the emergency alarm began to blare, a piercing, mechanical siren echoed through the walls, accompanied by the flashing red strobe lights of the automated system. Critical failure. Atmospheric pressure dropping. Initiating level 5 purge. The sudden loud noise broke the trance. I jerked my hand back, slamming my head against the steel wall behind me. The pain cleared the fog from my brain instantly. The tendril on the floor recoiled violently, hissing like a stepped-on viper, and whipped back under the door into the main room. Outside, the clicking footsteps panicked. The entity didn't like the sirens. It didn't like the high-frequency alarm tones that were designed to test the bunker's emergency systems. I heard the wet mass scrambling back toward the ventilation shaft, screeching as it forced itself back up into the narrow metal pipe. The sound faded rapidly as it retreated up toward the surface, fleeing the deafening alarm. The sirens continued to wail, bathing the small closet in rhythmic pulses of red light. I sat there in the dark, shaking, holding my bruised head in my hands. I survived the night, but the automated voice on the loudspeaker was already repeating its final warning. "Atmospheric purge complete. Reserve oxygen remaining. 12%. I have 12% oxygen left. The surface is inhabited by monsters that were the voices of the people I loved. And as I look at the closet door, I realize I have a choice to make before the sun comes up tomorrow. I can sit here in the dark and quietly fall asleep as the air runs out, or I can turn the wheel, open the blast door, and finally see what the world looks like now. 12%. The red numbers on the emergency display flickered in the darkness of the closet like a dying pulse. 12% oxygen meant roughly 14 hours of breathing time left if I remained completely still, keeping my heart rate low and my breaths shallow. 14 hours to decide how I wanted to die. I pushed open the door of the storage closet and stepped back into the main living quarters of sublevel 4. The room was a nightmare of shadows. The ventilation grate lay on the concrete floor, twisted like a piece of tin foil, surrounded by drying pools of that thick, black, oily liquid. The air in the room was already changing. It felt thin, cold, and tasted like ash. My lungs burned with every inhalation. A sharp, dull ache settling deep in my chest. I walked over to the control console. The main screen was still dead, but the analog pressure gauges along the top rim were slowly dropping into the red zone. The external air intake valves had sealed themselves automatically during the alarm, cutting off the bunker from the atmosphere above. If I wanted to live past tomorrow morning, I had to fix the intake system, and the primary manual bypass valve wasn't in sub-level 4. It was in sub-level 6. The lower levels had been condemned 3 months into the blackout. A catastrophic water pipe burst had flooded the bottom tiers of the complex, turning the stairwells into dark, freezing shafts of stagnant water and subterranean mud. Miller and I had welded the heavy iron hatch to sub-level 5 shut, hanging a rusted padlock over the latch with a painted sign, "Do not enter." Unstable structure. I looked at the heavy bronze key hanging on the wall rack next to my cot down there, deep in the flooded dark where the emergency lights had died months ago. The air pressure was managed by a secondary mechanical pump. If I could reach sub-level 6, manually clear the blocked valves, and restart the auxiliary pump, I could restore the oxygen scrubbers for another 6 months. Or I could drown in 30 feet of pitch-black water in the bowels of the earth. I grabbed the heavy bronze key, a waterproof tactical flashlight, and a crowbar from the maintenance locker. I strapped a secondary emergency oxygen canister to my belt. It held 15 minutes of pressurized air, barely enough to buy me time if the ambient air down there was toxic. I walked to the end of the corridor, stopping in front of the reinforced hatch that led down to the lower levels. The iron was freezing to the touch. When I pressed my ear against the cold metal, I didn't hear the sound of dripping water or creaking pipes. I heard music, faint, distorted, coming from deep below the earth. It was a piano melody, playing a slow, melancholic waltz. The notes were warped by distance and echoed through the flooded shafts like a ghost playing in a drowned cathedral. It was the song my mother used to play on our old upright piano when I was a child. My fingers tightened around the handle of the crowbar. They knew I was coming down. They had been waiting for me to run out of choices. I inserted the key into the heavy padlock, turned it until it popped open with a sharp, metallic clap, and lifted the latch. The air that rushed out from the dark opening was suffocatingly cold. It smelled of wet copper, stagnant lake water, and something sickly sweet, like rotting fruit. I clicked on my flashlight. The powerful beam cut down into the darkness, revealing a steep flight of iron stairs covered in a thick layer of black, gelatinous moss. The water level had receded slightly, leaving the upper steps exposed, dripping with dark condensation. I began my descent, taking one slow, deliberate step at a time, holding tightly to the rusted handrail. With every step I took, the piano music grew louder. It wasn't coming from a speaker. It was coming from the water itself. The sound vibrated through the metal risers of the stairs, traveling up through the soles of my boots and shaking my bones. 10 steps, I whispered to myself, trying to anchor my mind. 10 steps to the sub-level 5 landing. At step 8, my boot hit water. It was black, thick, and so cold it felt like liquid ice seeping through the leather of my boots. I raised the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the submerged corridor of sub-level 5. The corridor was completely flooded. Doors to old barracks and storage rooms floated half open, their wooden frames swollen and rotting. Shadows danced across the water's surface as the flashlight beam flickered slightly, and then I saw the faces, submerged 3 feet beneath the dark surface of the water. Looking up at me through the black liquid were dozens of human forms. They weren't floating corpses. Their skin wasn't bloated or pale. It was dark, shimmering, smooth as glass, covered in that same oily substance I had seen in the vent. They were standing perfectly upright on the flooded floor, their eyes wide open, glowing with a faint, bioluminescent silver light beneath the water. Dozens of former bunker residents, people from the upper levels who had vanished during the first weeks of the collapse. They weren't dead. As my flashlight beam hit them, their eyes tracked the light in unison. Their mouths opened under the water, releasing small, silver bubbles that floated to the surface, popping with soft, whispering sounds. Join the choir. Mark, the bubbles whispered as they broke the surface. The water is warm. I took a sharp breath, ripping the oxygen mask to my face. I didn't look back down into the water. I kept my eyes fixed on the heavy steel door at the end of the flooded hallway, the door to the sub-level 6 pump station. I waded forward. The water rose to my chest, freezing heavy, dragging against my legs like wet wool with every step I took. The figures beneath the surface reached upward. Dark, slender hands covered in black oil broke through the water, their cold fingers brushing against my legs, my waist, my arms. They weren't trying to drown me. They were trying to pull me down into their posture, trying to align my body with theirs so I could stand in the dark water and sing with them forever. Get off, I growled through my teeth, swinging the crowbar wild into the water. The iron tools struck something hard, not bone, but a dense, rubbery mass that absorbed the impact without a sound. I reached the door to sub-level 6. The mechanical turn wheel was rusted solid. I jammed the flat edge of the crowbar into the spokes of the iron wheel, placing all my weight onto the steel bar. My muscles screamed in protest. The air in my chest was thin, and my vision swam with bright red spots as hyperventilation began to set in. Turn. Damn you, turn. I gasped with a deafening screech of snapping rust. The wheel yielded. It turned 90 degrees, disengaging the interlocking pins. I threw my weight against the door. It swung open into the darkness of sub-level 6, and the water in the hallway rushed inward with a violent splash, dragging me along with the current. I tumbled across the wet concrete floor of the pump room, losing my flashlight in the deluge. The heavy door slammed shut behind me under the pressure of the backflowing water, sealing with a dull, hollow thud. Darkness. Total, absolute darkness. I lay on my back on the flooded floor, gasping for air. The ambient air in sub-level 6 was thick, wet, and smelled heavily of oil and sulfur, but there was oxygen here. The pressure gauges on the wall were humming with a low, mechanical vibration. I reached blindly across the wet floor, my fingers searching for the dropped flashlight. My hand brushed against something smooth, cold and cylindrical. The flashlight. I clicked the switch. A weak, flickering beam of yellow light illuminated the massive room. The pump station was huge, dominated by 3 industrial diesel engines that looked like sleeping iron leviathans in the dark. Pipes as thick as tree trunks stretched up toward the ceiling, vanishing into the shadows above. In the center of the room, standing atop the main generator housing, was a figure. It was wearing Miller's yellow rain jacket. The jacket was torn, stained with black oil, hanging loosely over a body that had been stretched unnaturally tall. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in long, pale fingers that tapped rhythmically against the metal generator casing. Tap, tap, tap. You made it, Mark. Miller's voice said from the shadows above. It wasn't coming from his mouth. His head was tilted backward at an impossible angle. His face smooth, featureless, devoid of eyes or nostrils, just a blank slate of grey skin. The voice was coming from a small, battery-powered radio strapped to his chest. I knew you'd come down. The radio crackled with static. The air's always sweeter near the bottom. I raised the crowbar, keeping my back pressed against the closed metal door. Where is the manual bypass? I demanded, my voice trembling. Show me the valve, or I'll smash that radio to pieces. The entity on the generator slowly bent its legs. Its knees cracked like dry branches as it squatted down, looking in my direction with its blank, featureless head. The valve is right behind me, Mark, the radio whispered. But turning it won't save you. It will only open the primary air shaft to the surface. It took a slow step down from the generator, its elongated limbs moving with a sickening, liquid grace. The surface isn't dead, the radio continued, the static growing louder, harsher. The sun didn't die. We just built a new canopy over the earth, a canopy made of voices, made of memories. If you turn that valve, you hear the whole world singing. I didn't listen. I lunged forward, scrambling up the narrow iron ladder attached to the side of the main generator, ignoring the entity that was crawling toward me along the wet floor. To the top of the platform sat the primary air valve, a massive red steel wheel connected to a 4-foot pipe that stretched all the way up through the mountain bedrock to the surface world. On the side of the pipe was a pressure lever marked Surface Vent Emergency Manual Override. I grabbed the red wheel with both hands. Mark, the choir's voice burst from the radio below. No longer gentle, no longer polite. It was a screeching wall of sound that shook the metal platform beneath my feet. Don't turn it. Long, black tendrils whipped up from the dark floor, wrapping around the rungs of the ladder. Scrambling up toward my legs, I braced my feet against the generator frame and turned the red wheel with every ounce of strength left in my body. Screech, the metal grooved. A heavy clanking sound echoed through the entire bunker complex as the ancient gears inside the wall engaged for the first time in 400 days. The pressure lever snapped downward. A sudden, deafening rush of air roared through the pipe. It wasn't toxic gas. It wasn't radiation. It was a vacuum. The enormous pressure differential between the sealed bunker and the atmosphere above created a massive howling draft. The black liquid on the floor was instantly sucked toward the intake pipe, drawn upward by the sheer force of the suction. The entity in Miller's jacket shrieked a high-pitched, inhuman sound that shattered the glass on the pressure gauges across the room. The tendrils wrapping around my boots were torn away, drawn helplessly into the rushing vortex of air that was pouring into the pipe. The entity was dragged off the generator platform, its elongated limbs flailing, as it was pulled violently toward the mouth of the primary intake shaft with a wet, sickening crunch. The black mass was sucked into the narrow steel pipe, vanishing up toward the surface with the rushing current. Silence returned to the pump room. The heavy industrial engines beneath my feet groaned, their rusted flywheels beginning to turn slowly as fresh air flooded the system. The automated systems were rebooting above my head. The green indicator light on the emergency panel flickered to life. Oxygen scrubbers online. Atmospheric pressure normalizing. I collapsed onto the metal platform, gasping for a real, cool, clean air that tasted of rain and pine needles. The air from the surface. I sat there for a long time, watching the green light pulse in the darkness. I survived. I fixed the pumps. I have enough oxygen now to live down here for another year. Perhaps two. But as I sat on that platform, listening to the clean wind roaring through the pipe from the world above, I realized something. The air wasn't carrying radiation. It was carrying the scent of flowers, wet earth, and fresh rain, and mixed into the wind. Coming from miles away across the surface of the dead earth, I could hear them, millions of voices, singing together in a beautiful, terrifying harmony. They are waiting up there. They have all the time in the world, and now the door between us is unlocked.